Well, good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. Nice to see everyone again. For those that don't know me, my name is Troy Zerveskes. My firm is Advisory Resource Group. We're a financial planning and wealth management firm that works pretty much exclusively with physicians and dentists. So really good to be here with everyone this evening. And I feel like wallpaper at the Dental Society and other events. So I sort of assume that everybody knows who I am. But I guess at the same time, maybe everybody doesn't know exactly what I do. So very grateful for the opportunity to come in tonight and kind of chat a little bit more about who we are, what we do, and how we support the dental community. So the meal where you are may be better than usual, maybe not, but hopefully at least everyone is in their sweatpants while they're watching this. So I hope this can be interactive tonight. I really don't like to just talk at people if I don't need to, so I'd love for you to join in. You're able to raise your hand and I can unmute you on the tool that we're using tonight. So please do that. If we have time at the end and we want to have a little bit of a group discussion, I know I've heard events like these that there's not a lot of time for collaboration in the community any longer, and so sometimes there's certain challenges or something that somebody might be facing, and if that's the case, certainly this is a great time to be able to have that discussion, and if we can facilitate that here, that would be great. If not, that's okay too. So I guess I'd begin by saying I think financial planning is always important, but I would say what I'm finding in my practice lately is more situations that planning is really important. I'd say people at later stages of their career feeling anxieties from COVID. I'm getting many more phone calls about I wasn't quite ready to retire, but if I wanted to sell my practice, what might that look like? The plan was still 5 years away, but I'm kind of thinking that, maybe I want to do that now. And I'm hearing more and more of that from people sort of in my community as well. So again, I think this discussion is maybe that much more pertinent than it might maybe usually be. So to begin about, who I am, I started practice in 1999. In 2003, I started speaking at medical and dental schools and residency programs about financial literacy. I'm still doing that today. In fact, actually today we were doing a video shoot in Bedford for financial literacy content that I'm doing in connection with Tufts. I work very closely with the medical school, and the dental school down there, and the practice management professor. Oops, Ashley, I lost you. Hopefully you'll be back with us. Just making sure hopefully everybody else is still with us. Oh, there you go. Okay, no, that's
I just shut off my webcam.
Oh, perfect. Nope, that's fine. I just took me off guard. So no, and if you want to jump off, that's fine too. So also I'm the founder of the Dental Resource Group. I think likely everybody here has been to a meeting of ours. That was something that was started a number of years ago, just feeling the need that there needed to be some cross-pollination among the advisors who work with the dental community. At the same time, we've tried to give back to the dental community as well, and hopefully, most everyone has been to one of our events. So who is ARG, Advisory Resource Group? I like to say that ARG creates a harmony between a dentist's personal and practice life. We operate from the premise that it's very difficult for a practice owner to know where their personal life stops and their practice life begins, and vice versa. We would also say that we believe that the better that somebody understands their personal planning, the more effectively they can make business decisions. And we believe the inverse of that is also true, that if you don't have a good sense of your personal financial plan, that it's much harder to make good business decisions. And that runs true at all stages. If we have our goals, we have what it is that we're trying to accomplish, and sometimes that can be, again, very challenging if we don't understand both sides of the equation. And that's one of the things that we pride ourselves on doing very well, or really seeking to do well, is that to both understand what it takes to run an effective dentist practice, but at the same time also having a good sense of personal financial planning and how those two connect with one another. We believe that if we look at a practice as a tool to fulfill our personal goals, now of course it fulfills our professional goals as well, but if we look at it as a tool that says, hey, I want to retire at a certain date and educate my children and happy medium of life and balance is very important to me. Or I'm looking to build an empire and I want to have 10 practices. We're going to make very different decisions and essentially support a practice in very different ways depending on those variables and circumstances. So and again, from our perspective, we work with all of those practices. And another thing that sets us apart a little bit is that we work with practices at all stages. A lot of advisors say, you need to have X amount of money before you can work with me. That never set well with me from the beginning of my career, because what I found is many times earlier stage dentists needed a lot more help than, say, mid-stage dentists. And some of the risks that they had of potentially not making the best decisions could really be like a domino effect for the rest of their career. And in fact, that's really what started me doing these financial literacy sessions, is that I would meet with someone and say, gosh, if I had just met with you 10 years earlier, things would be very different. So again, something we do a little different is that we want to work with people at all stages of their career. We're fee-based. So some people, the first question we get is, well, how do you get paid? We are a registered investment advisor with the state of New Hampshire. We're fee-based, so oftentimes we're supporting a client while they maintain all the same relationships with their advisors, but they're looking for somebody to just be a helicopter, if you will, or sort of hover over the top to say, hey, is everything okay? Is everything the way that it should be? Really to get a second look on things, if you will. Other times we have clients that want us to do everything, and we're doing full service wealth management and managing their retirement plan and so forth. So there's really not a lot we don't do, and we also pride ourselves on facilitating the right and appropriate advisors given the stage of our clients' lives. Real quick, I'd say process over product. That's something that we say very regularly. Which is that all of our clients work from a financial plan first, and then any implementation or anything that we might do comes much later. Again, from my perspective, if we don't have a very good sense of what we're trying to accomplish on the personal level and the practice level, it's much harder to implement the appropriate tools in order to support both the practice and the personal financial plan. We think that that's something that the industry does very wrong because many advisors don't use financial plans. I spend a lot of money on software and a lot of money on office infrastructure in order to be able to do that for my clients. And we feel that a lot of financial advisors kind of want to go to the last step first, which we look at as oftentimes the easy part. The implementation, managing money, is sort of the fun part. The difficult part is understanding why are we doing what we're doing, and how does it impact the goals and objectives that we have. So what I'd like to do tonight is really run through some live interactive case studies of how we do what we do. So again, I'd love interaction. You're able to raise your hand, and I'd love to take your questions along the way. And I've talked about doing this for a while, but I haven't actually done it, so I don't know if it will last 20 minutes or 2 hours. I promise I won't make it last 2 hours, but again, your feedback is really helpful, and I'd much rather sit here and have a discussion than just talk at you all night. Especially with, I'm sure you've all been doing a lot more of these, but it's a very interesting medium when you're giving a presentation like this and you're just talking at everybody out in the audience. So much more fun to be with everyone and have a little laughter once in a while even. So I think everything on the screen here, I've mentioned my talk. So where I'm going to begin, everybody should see my screen. Yep. So I'm going to start. I took this is an excerpt from a presentation that I do down at Tufts. And so it's geared, I guess you'd say, a little bit more towards the earlier stage dentist, and we're going to spend most of the night speaking more of the later stage dentist. But I think it's important to the discussion. So I look at 21st century dentists and I say they face significant risks and have a small margin of error in their decision making. And really where this is coming from is that new stage dentist who's graduating with $300,000 or $400,000 of debt is buying $1 million practice and is buying a $500,000 house, right? That dentist has $2 million of debt before they've really started. When I say they have a small margin of error, I don't think there's a lot of room for them to misstep when you have that level of debt. You have to run everything really on all cylinders in order to make sure that that leverage works the way that it's supposed to work. And then those risks and decisions build on one another. So, if a decision might be made earlier in a career that, could have these reverberations, again, we paid our debt off, not off incorrectly, but maybe we chose the incorrect payoff schedule and that reverberated through and impacted other things. Again, those will continue to build on one another. So that decision making is really consequential to long-term success. And I say this starts in a recent graduate, but it really is true of dentists at every stage. When do we add on? I need another operatory. Is it appropriate to do it now? I need to give my practice a facelift. Am I too close to when I think I'm going to be getting out of my practice? Right? All of those things have an impact on, again, what will the profitability of the practice be after we do that renovation? So again, that decision making is consequential to the big picture. So one thing that I talk about regularly with my clients is that we need to take a step back and evaluate the big picture. We don't want to make decisions in a vacuum. We want to understand how everything fits with one another. And that really plays into the last piece, which is the specialized tools, which I'm going to share with you this evening. Just as your toys have become more fun, so have mine. So we really have the ability to model and look at a number of different situations before we ever make them. And it's incredibly helpful to be able to do that for me and to make sure that I'm giving the best advice. But I believe it's incredibly helpful for my clients as well to be able to look through a number of what-if scenarios, if you will, before they ever ultimately make that decision. And that's especially true of the retiree who's looking at a number of different options, which we're going to show and talk about tonight. So one last thing on this piece that I just think is sort of an interesting is, we look at evaluating debt payoff periods. And I think this is just an illustration how planning can sometimes be counterintuitive. That we might hear one thing or think of something because of it's what the media tells us, but the reality is that it might be very different, especially how it relates to a dentist. So one is when dental students are coming out, they might hear from their parents, they might hear from their parents' financial advisors, pay off your debt as soon as you possibly can. These federal interest rates are high, you need to get this debt paid off. Where in reality, that might not be the best approach, given what their objectives are. So what we did here, this is just, again, comes from a presentation that we are continuing to do. And understand, I'm taking a lot of liberties here. There are a number of assumptions made to get to where I'm getting to, but it just, in overall big picture, just wanted to kind of give you a sense of what I'm talking about here. So essentially what we're doing is evaluating student loan payoff periods in relation to retirement values and lifetime earnings values, if you will. And so in this scenario, this is a 10-year payoff, and it says that at retirement, they have 8.8 million with 22.7 of asset value at death. And again, we're looking at that as lifetime earnings. And a 15-year is 9.7 and 26. So 8.7 and 22, 15-year is 9.7 and 26. Well, that's not an insignificant difference between a 10-year payoff and a 15-year payoff. And again, to kind of let you know what's happening there is that means they're not saving for that time period, they're just paying off debt, and that has more far-reaching implications down the road. A 20-year is not so different than the 15-year, 9.5 versus 25.7. So again, not too different, but a little bit. But what the context of this discussion is we look at how long it might take someone to buy a practice by making one decision over the other. And the variable that we use to determine when they could buy a practice is having 10% of that practice value saved. So most of the lenders require you to have some percentage of the practice saved. You don't necessarily have to put it towards the practice. In fact, in most cases, you do not. But you need to have, on average, 10% of the practice value. So if you're buying $1 million practice, you need to have, $100,000 somewhere in your savings. So when we went through this scenario, and again, in the background, there's a lot of other things happening here. What it said is that in a 10-year payoff, we weren't able to save that 10% until year 12. And in a 20-year payoff, we saved it in year 6. Well, the relevance here is that if our goal is to buy a practice, And if we subscribe to the idea that as a practice owner, we might be able to earn $100,000 more, and you could argue more or less depending on your feelings about that, but let's just use that as a number. That could be a $600,000 difference over 6 years. And so again, that conventional wisdom that says pay off your debt as quickly as you can for a dental student really might not apply that's trying to purchase a practice. So again, it just says that sometimes these things, especially when you put them through a dental specific filter, might be counterintuitive to what we might think and what maybe the larger community of advisors might provide for advice to to their clients. So I'm going to move on from here. So any questions? I'm just going to keep looking here, and again, if anybody wants to raise their hand. Excuse me one moment. Oh, great question. How do I classify and differentiate the stages? Newer dentist, middle stage dentist, later stage dentist. It's a little bit of a little ambiguous, maybe a little bit of a moving target. I think the way that the Dental Society describes the new dentists, I think, is anybody in the first 10 years in their career. I don't think that's so different from how I would describe that, although maybe 10 is a little bit long. And then, a retiring dentist or later stage dentist to me, I'd say is, probably anybody within 10 years of looking to exit their career. So somewhere in that frame is I think what I would consider there. So actually, oops, Dr. Zeros, I'm trying to unmute you, and it looks like you might be muted on your end. There you go. You should be good now. Oh, from my end, it looks like I should be able to hear you. No? Well, we can keep trying. So I'm sorry about that. On my end, it looks like I should be able to hear you. I've got a green microphone, but apparently there's something going on that's not allowing me to. So maybe if you want to write like last time, and then I can, I'll answer the question that way. So what we'll do to get started here is kind of begin a case study, if you will, for someone in the retirement stage of their career. So if we look at, this would be a 60-year-old couple, and we'll start by looking at their balance sheet. So they have some savings and checking and savings. They have a non-retirement portfolio, if you will. Oop, Dr. Zeros? I'm saying offline. A non-retirement portfolio, so that could be a brokerage account. Again, anything that's just not in a retirement account. Wealth distribution account, that's really, and for our sake here, is the same thing as a non-retirement account. A simple IRA is just their retirement plan that they have at the practice. A spouse 401k plan. They have a dental practice that's worth about $750,000. They have the real estate of the dental practice. They own a condo in Florida. They have their primary residence, and they have some automobiles. And then currently they have some liabilities in the dental practice, the real estate, the Florida mortgage, and the home mortgage. So their net worth is about $3.1 million. And again, they're 60 years old and thinking about retiring, selling the practice in say a 5-year time frame. The first thing that I want to say tonight is this is very much going to be like drinking from a fire hose. I'm showing you a lot of numbers sort of out of context. So I really hope that we can get the ideas across about how this works. Certainly feel free to follow up with me afterwards if you have any specific questions as well. And I'm going to try to walk through this as simply as possible. But there's sort of like in your business, there's sometimes no easy way when you're dealing with a lot of complexity. So again, that's the balance sheet. And then if we move on to, oops. So working on to a budget, and I'm going to make this a little bit larger in case anybody's having trouble seeing my screen. So this is something in every financial plan, whether somebody's making $30,000, $300,000, or $3 million. The first thing that we're going to talk about is their cash flow. What is the flow of money through the household? How much is coming in? How much is going out? Do we have a sense of what that is? And oftentimes they don't. These are muscles for many people that have to be built. I can't tell you how many times I've met with a client or beginning client, and I ask them, do you know how much you spend on a monthly basis? And the answer is not a clue. I've had some clients where we've spent hours separating credit card expenses from the practice and their personal life because everything went onto one credit card. So, again, everybody's starting at a different place here, and that's perfectly reasonable. Again, at the end of the day, it becomes very important, especially, I think at earlier stages of the career, budgeting becomes important because you're trying to understand, okay, what's left over that I can use to make progress. But at later stages of your career, it really becomes important because you're trying to set yourself up for retirement, and oftentimes you don't get a second chance at retirement. You have to live within the confines of a monthly income, and if we go outside of those confines, then that could have more significant consequences. So for a lot of people who are in that later stage of their career and thinking about selling their practice in retirement, this is a brand new exercise that they've never done. And to be honest, it can be like pulling teeth to get them to do the budget because it's just so hard and it's not a way that they've ever thought before. So sometimes we're just walking through sort of these types of things early on just to kind of say, okay, how can we do that? So one tidbit of a nugget, if you will, one of the ways that we do that is by lumping everything into a credit card. So, credit cards used to be a dirty word, and I think some of us still use them because of the convenience sake. But from a budgeting perspective, if we kind of think about household cash flow, if everything's going on a credit card, then there's really only a handful of things that aren't, right? We might pay a landscaping bill and our mortgage and maybe some utilities, but mostly everything else goes on the credit card. What's really nice about that is that we know exactly what we spend every month. And at any point throughout the month, we can kind of take a snapshot to say, hey, where are we? And if we set up our confines and say we can have 10 grand a month on the credit card or 8 grand a month or 15, it really doesn't matter, then it becomes a really easy way to track where we're at. And as I tell my clients most of the time, it really doesn't, I don't need to know what you're spending it on. I don't care. As long as we know that the financial plan is set up that you can have that 10 grand a month. If you get to 8 and there's 2 left over, go burn it, go to Foxwoods. It really doesn't matter to me. But if you set up the financial plan for 10 and you're spending 12, well, that again could reverberate and have more significant consequences, especially in the long term. So again, that's just one tidbit that you might see here. But if you look down through these different expenses, mostly things that you'd recognize: utilities, the credit card bill, which is all their variable expenses, home insurance for both homes, auto insurance, umbrella coverage, and miscellaneous, and some travel and so forth in there. And again, if I'm going too fast and anybody wants to chime in, Ashley, certainly tell me to slow down or be the voice of the group if you'd like to be. So the next place that this brings us to, this is a page that in most every plan we're coming back to over and over. So each of these verticals are years, so 2021, 2022, 23, and beyond. And then from here, we aggregate taxable investments. So again, if you recall, that was the non-retirement accounts, retirement accounts, cash accounts. So we get a sense of, again, what the overall assets are. And then we itemize and aggregate inflows. So we have the dental practice income, we have spousal salary, and then the way that we have this built here is that the practice is paying the dentist income for the rent. So we have total inflows of $325,000. We then have living expenses, so that $131,000 came right off of that last sheet that we were on, which was the result of the budget and all of those expenses. I'm going to skip over spent savings for a moment, if you will. and go on to liabilities. So liabilities, that's just the aggregate of all of those different liabilities. So the Florida mortgage for the condo, the residence mortgage, and I believe there was an auto payment in there as well. So that's just the aggregate of all of those payments. And then we have taxes, and we have planned savings. And this planned savings is that simple IRA and some contributions by the spouse into the 401k. So what spent savings is here is I can tell the system to either say, hey, anything that's left over, let's just save that somewhere. Let's just assume that it's being accumulated in cash. Or I can say, you know what, let's assume that anything that we don't tell the system that we're saving is just going to go sort of like this. So this is the more conservative approach in a plan like this, because sometimes if I assume that somebody's going to save something, it's not uncommon that that doesn't actually get saved. So I think this is a more conservative approach for planning purposes. So, you know, oftentimes the first place we go from here, and whoops, we have lots of different places that we can go, but the first place that we might go is just to say, okay, well, how are we doing? Let me also just say that this base plan, which is the first plan that we're looking at, is assuming that we are selling the practice and selling the building at age 65. So basically at retirement, we're saying, you know, we're divesting ourselves of everything, and we're moving. we're taking off and going to Fiji. So again, if we go here, you know, again, there's lots of numbers on the page, but if I can just point your attention to the middle, essentially it's saying that this person's earliest retirement could begin at age 63. So that's a good gut check to start to say, okay, good, we know that we're at least on a good trajectory here. So another way to look at this same information is like this. So this, again, so here's the graphical depiction, which makes it a little bit easier for some people to say, okay, if there's blue, that's a good thing. And here's what it looks like by the numbers. So to start, I would say bring your eyes way over to the right side of the screen to total portfolio assets. And that says essentially what's happening in their portfolio, combined portfolios year over year. If you go over to the left, then you can begin to see that same information that was on that last page. So if we just start on the top line, 2021, inflows is 325,000, that's their income, and that's the only inflow that's coming into the household. Sometimes there can be inflows from other places. Their expenses, that 298, I can actually get really fun here. I can drill down further and I can say that their living expenses, their liability payments, and their taxes, that's where that 298 is coming from. And then planned savings. So again, that's the simple contribution and the 401k contribution. And then this net cash flow here, the reason it says 0 is again because of that spent savings. I'm assuming if there's any extra that that's going somewhere else. And then that brings us to total portfolio assets of 1.6 million. And again, you know, if you're into numbers, we can go through this year by year by year. And then at 65, this 1.3 inflow is the value of the practice and the value of the real estate. And so now their total portfolio assets are 3.2 million. So if we keep walking down here year over year, now if you look at 67, way over to the left again, Social Security is starting to come in. So that's their inflow. And then if you look way over to the right again, you start to see that net cash flow is the amount that they have to remove from their portfolios every year in order to meet their obligations that were on that page that we looked at a moment ago, what we call the 5-year cash flow. And we can keep doing this year over year over year. And we get to the end and we say, great, at age 90, the check on the casket certainly does not bounce. There are still assets here. And so we could look at this and say, this is a good plan. This is a good trajectory. There's certain assumptions that we're making here, and this is the fun part of planning. We can decide what the rates of return are and what the inflation levels are. So this is assuming a 6% rate of return, I believe is how we have it set in the system. That's usually in retirement is a reasonable rate of return. but with inflation at around 3.5%, which is a big part of this analysis. It's that idea that unfortunately we can't put everything in cash because that inflation becomes sort of a slow cancer of watering away at our purchasing power over the years. So if inflation is growing at 3.5% and we have everything in cash that's earning 0.5%, then we're losing 3% a year on that money. So again, the way the system is, we're looking at this is we've got a 6% rate of return and a 3.5% inflation. So we could do a 5% return and a 2% inflation, or someone could say, well, I'm the best investor in the world, I'm going to get 9% a year. Again, this is your plan. So we let our clients, really those that want to be involved in that level of detail, this really can become theirs in any way that they want it to be. So, but again, all things considered, this person is on a very good trajectory using common assumptions that would typically be used. So here's where the fun part begins. So we look at planning as an iterative process, right? Where we begin by creating this base plan to say, hey, what's the trajectory that I'm on right now? And is that going to ultimately get me to where I want to go? And sometimes it does, like this. Sometimes it doesn't. But either way, it's an iterative process where we can go through a number of different what-if scenarios so that we can get the result that we want. So why don't we go ahead and do that? So the first one is, you know what? I don't think I'm going to sell my building. I think I'm going to rent it. So at retirement, rather than getting that sale, excuse me, I'm going to collect rent. And so if you look here, probably the quickest way to see this is that if you recall down here before, this was 1.3 million, I believe it was. Now it's 823,000. And if you look, the portfolio isn't as large, but now we have the additional inflows that are coming in through that rent. Well, here's the fun part of when I said that my tools are a little bit more exciting now. And back in the day when I first got in the business, we had the what was it, the MS-DOS, the clicking cursor that we would go over and push different buttons in order to get a result. So we're having a lot more fun now. So again, so then I can compare the two against one another. So if you look, on the left side is base facts, which is the selling the practice and selling the real estate. On the right side, it's selling the practice and renting the real estate. And so again, as I pointed out a moment ago, before we were getting the influx from the real estate and the practice, which was giving us 3.2 of assets, well, now we only have 2.7, almost 2.8 of assets. So when we follow this down year over year over year, what's interesting is that it wasn't all that much different. Now, what are some things that we know, right? If we own real estate, there's probably going to be some upkeep involved. There's probably going to be some tenant issues, maybe a few months of not having rent, potentially a down market without a tenant. So we certainly know that there's risk on that side. On the other side, are we always going to get 6 or 7% on our investments? The answer is no. And so we have to deal with that side of the risk. So this doesn't always come out this close, but in this instance, it was very close to one another of renting versus buying the real estate. Excuse me, renting versus selling the real estate. So then we say, okay, I like the idea of renting. I think that's really, this client says that calls out to me and seems to make more sense. I don't know why I would get rid of that asset when I've got such a good asset that I've put money into. So we're going to now look at that as our base plan, if you will, and we're going to compare everything else to that. So if we look here, the next one is, you know what? I think I want to sell the practice, rent the building, and what if I pay off my mortgages? What's better? Is it better to just rent the building, or is it better to rent the building and then pay off all my mortgages at the same time once I get that influx from selling the practice? So again, we can go down and we can compare at any time. So, we might say, okay, at age 66, what's the difference? Well, we don't have as much cash or as many assets because we've used them to pay down the mortgage. And then what happens over time? And if we look at the very end, it's a difference. It's a subtle difference, but it's still a difference in that the scenario of not paying off the mortgages was more advantageous than the scenario of paying off the mortgages. Now, again, in this particular situation, these people didn't have, all that significant of mortgages. So let's say they might have had a $500,000 or $600,000 or $700,000 mortgage. Well, that could certainly move the needle more than it did in this case. But that becomes a very, popular scenario as well. Is it better to save this money, or is it better to pay off debt with this money? And I think we find that to happen at all stages of the career. I think at early stages, the question is, I've got some extra, I haven't started saving for retirement yet. Is it better to put it there, or should I be paying down these debts that again are a little bit scary to me? So we're able to run the different analysis to determine, okay, well, what might be, based on these assumptions, the better path. So that's one thing that we might often do. So the next one is, well, you know what? I want to spend more. Troy, I kind of like the idea. It's nice. I'm going to make it. You said I'm on a good trajectory. So if that's the case, let's go to town. Let's take some more trips and let's spend. So that's going to be on the right side of the page now. And in this situation, what they asked me is, we want to spend $30,000 more for the rest of their retirement years. Uh-oh, it didn't work. So if you look here, the check on the casket is going to bounce. They run out of money at age 86. So that doesn't give us much margin of error. So in this situation, my answer would be that is probably not a great idea. So this is where the iterative process comes. Okay, well, what if I only did that additional spending for the first 10 years? Ah, okay, that's better. Now we've got almost $1 million left at the end. Well, that's still not that much of a margin that gives us, comfort, if you will. We're still on a declining schedule that, whether it be a declining market, something of that nature, could have an impact on. So then we talk about, well, you know what, we're going to use the condo, but really realistically, probably only for the next 10 years. Then after that, I'm not so sure we want to deal with, traveling to Florida and all that goes along with that. At that point, we're in our mid to late 70s. I think at that point, why don't we go ahead and sell the condo? So if we have that additional spending for the first 10 years, with the idea that we're going to sell the condo at the end of 10 years, boom. Now we're looking better than we did in our base scenario. So in this, sorry, I didn't mean to move so quickly. So in this scenario, we were able to solve their needs by just looking at things a little bit differently, give them more money to travel in the early stage of their retirement, and then likely something they might have done anyways. And that's the thing, it's not that we're recreating the wheel here, we're not, but it's just being able to have the confidence to say, hey, if I line things up a certain way, will that work? Rather than saying, it should work. If I sell my condo 10 years into retirement and I get that money, I'll just put that towards my kitty, and that should be able to create income. The problem is for a lot of people, that doesn't provide the confidence that they need, and they might be thinking about 10 different things, right? I mean, it's not uncommon for, when working with someone, that we might look at 10 different scenarios. I mean, I've maybe even 15. I mean, I've it's, people that really, I'd say the people who are most technical, that really get involved with this and really like looking at numbers, there's really the sky's the limit in terms of how many different ways we can look at things. So, but really what the point, the concept that I'm trying to get across here, more than the numbers, is just to say that by looking at things through different lenses, we're able to come to different results. And so again, in the world that we're in right now, especially I wasn't planning to retire for 5 more years, but I'm not really comfortable going to work anymore. And I'm having a lot of those types of conversations lately. These types of tools are vital to be able to give everybody comfort in terms of making those decisions. Or unfortunately, sometimes having the difficult discussion saying that it can't work. Or and again, forgive me for my monologue here, that we need to be a little more creative. Maybe we never thought about bringing in an associate, but now maybe we do. And maybe now it looks more like an absentee owner type situation, but we're still keeping the practice, paying down debt. Maybe our income isn't quite as high as it would have been before, but we're still accomplishing our goals. And again, I think this goes back to that idea of understanding both sides of the equation, right? If we're just looking at it through the investment lens, there's really not a lot of advice to add on the dental side. But if we're looking at it holistically and we say, hey, there's a whole host of ways that we can get this practice transitioned, some of them might happen quickly, some of them might be over time. I think we can meet your objectives. It might just look a little bit different than you might have once thought that it would. Again, if I'm going too fast or anybody has any questions, please let me know. In fact, let me just look real quick to see if anybody does. Okay, great. So again, that sort of brings us through there. And then, so here's another one. And again, I think you get the point is my guess, but let me just show you another one, which is, Troy, I'd like to sell the practice at 60 and then I'll work part-time to 65. Am I able to do that? Well, not so bad, right? There, again, the check on the casket isn't bouncing, but it certainly doesn't give them as much padding as if they had before. So let me do this one. So then we can look at things in a number of different pressure tests, if you will. I think you might have had advisors or you might have opinions on people saying, hey, you should buy long-term care. It's expensive. I don't want to buy long-term care. And it is. It's very expensive. And so, and some people, to be honest, you could argue don't need it from a financial perspective. There might be social, emotional reasons why they purchase that, but maybe financially they're in a position that they don't necessarily need it. Early in my career, we worked with a Ralston Purina exec who had a pension that was $1 million a year. He bought the biggest long-term care policy that he could, and his reason was, well, I love my wife and she loves me, and the last thing that I want to do is be dealing with those less than glorious situations. I want to be able to have somebody else coming in, and if I don't have some other bucket of money to come in, then I'm going to be doing it myself because I just know how I deal with money. So again, there's lots of reasons why people might or might not do these things, and again, that's not what tonight's discussion is about. But I think there is some validity in looking at, all right, well, what might it do to my financial situation if I did hit an event along the way? And so this just gives you an idea that it could, in this situation, be reasonably devastating if there was an event that happened along the way. So I do have a question asking, what do I think about reverse mortgages in retirement? Well, I'll say this. We always start with a financial plan, and then we look at all the different tools that exist and determine which of those tools is most appropriate to hold up the financial plan that we've created. I'll say in my world, we don't do a lot of work with reverse mortgages. Our industry really doesn't like them. In fact, the broker dealer that I work with really doesn't even want me talking about them, to be completely honest. So I'd say it's a tool. They're available. There's certain situations where there might not be other options, and so that's when a reverse mortgage might work. And not saying that it couldn't work in other situations as well, but I'd say in my practice, it's not something that I do a lot of work with. And thank you for the question, by the way. So again, really what I'm trying to show here is that we have a lot of options to look at a problem from a number of different angles to get to the solution that our clients are looking to get to. And sometimes we don't, right? Sometimes you can't get water from a stone, but oftentimes by looking at things through a different lens and putting a creative filter on it, especially as it relates to the practice, can oftentimes allow us to get to the result that we want. But we have to be able to take that step back, look at the big picture in order to be able to come to that result. And I think if we didn't have the ability to do that, the result that we come to might be a very different result. So real quickly, I'll just go through a couple other things that I like to show here. If nothing else, just to give you an idea of what we're able to do. So we're able to look at the income tax implications of each decision. So again, it kind of shows us, well, what would taxes look like as a part of this? That's part of the collaboration. I'm a huge fan of working with clients, CPAs, attorneys. It's not uncommon that a client's CPA has never talked to the client's attorney, yet they've got a pretty robust estate plan in place. So I'm a huge fan of collaborating. And these tools are often a great way to do that, because trying to explain in concept to the CPA, what the attorney has suggested for the estate plan and how that's going to, again, work through things and then as it relates to the financial plan can sometimes be really difficult. So if we use this as the baseline, it's not uncommon for us all to be around a table, or these days on a virtual call, where everybody can see what's going on and use this as a jumping off point, which can be really helpful. Jumping back into the retirement module. So the other thing I should say, I did not do this tonight, but of course we're analyzing things like life insurance and disability insurance and different protection elements of the plan, education funding, if for children, and even at this stage of life, we certainly could have had some of that in there as well. Just for simplicity purposes, I did not add that in. But of course, looking at where's the right pool to take from, timing, what if the market's down, all of those things are, of course, part of the process of understanding how everything fits together. So real quickly, I was just going to run back to retirement planning. And we looked at options for meeting needs before. Well, sometimes a client will say, well, Troy, the reality is I want to spend the absolute most that I can, and I do want the check on my casket to bounce. And I've had those conversations before. Everybody has a very different feeling of how they look at wealth transfer and so forth. But this is just a fun tool that allows us to say, well, in this situation, they were trying to spend $132,000 a year, but the plan would still fit together at $152,000 a year. So again, just a helpful gut check to kind of say, okay, what are the confines we're working within here? So we talked about that. So, I think you might have had an advisor talk to you about an annuity. You might have an opinion on an annuity. You might say they're the best thing since sliced bread. You might say they're criminal. Again, not here to have that conversation tonight. But what I will say is, in the 21st century, with the volatility that we see in the markets, and the fact that we don't have pensions anymore, we don't have guaranteed sources of income for most people other than Social Security, we don't have a lot of guaranteed income coming in. And so that puts a lot of stress on the portfolio. And depending on how well we're exceeding our goals or below what we need, there can be some concerns there. So this is another report that we're able to look at to say, okay, if you need $120,000 a month, how much of that 120 is coming in by way of guaranteed sources, and how much of it is coming in by way of stress on the portfolio. So again, just another tool that we have to examine and look at. But what I'll also say is that, to me, I've never understood the idea of, hey, you should have this. Right? And I think a lot of financial advisors, and maybe early in my career, before I had these tools, maybe I would argue I did a little of the same thing. But I don't believe that in the world that we're in now, anyone should ever make a financial decision without knowing the impact that that decision is going to have on their overall plan. Again, permanent insurance, another potentially contentious tool, annuities, all of these things. Even how we set up our investments and so forth, there can be lots of different differing opinions on. So again, my feeling is you should have a good understanding of where you want to be, where you want to go, and any tool you use, reverse mortgage earlier, any tool you use, you want to have an understanding of how does that get me to where I want to go? How does that support that financial plan that I've created? And here's the fun part, it changes. My favorite saying, and any of my clients can tell you that I say this regularly, is that it's a process, not an event, right? This is something that we begin, We put everything out on the table, we sort it out, we create the best plan in the world, and then 6 months later, something happens, a pandemic, right? And everything we thought that we were working towards is now completely different, and we have to look at things completely different again. Now, what I'll say is that when we have a tool like this that's already set up, that pivoting is very easy, or much easier, at least I should say, that we're not starting from scratch, we're just going back in and changing the variables. And that's very common. So again, even without a pandemic, that's a very common occurrence. So just gives you a sense of some of the tools. And then the last one that I'll show you, just to give you an idea here, again, are things like analyzing investment portfolios and so forth. So if we look at, excuse me one moment, just takes me a second here. So on the left side, it's their current simple IRA asset allocation. Asset allocation just being the choices they've made for stocks and bonds and so forth. And then on the right side of the page is what their, let's say, target or optimal asset allocation should be. So on the left side, they're within striking distance of retirement, and they're in an account that has roughly 80% equities and 20% fixed income, where the reality is for someone at that stage of life, maybe they want to be more in a 50% equity or 60% equity portfolio. Again, I'm not giving blanket advice tonight. There's a lot of different factors that go into that, but just as a tool for illustration purposes, it just shows that we're able to really go in at a pretty detailed level and say, hey, if this is what you're supposed to have and this is what you have, how might we make changes in order to get to that sort of model portfolio, if you will. So, and the last thing, I think I already said it, is to going in, we can look at elements of the business, estate plan, education plan. So again, if you have an estate, an attorney has said, hey, we want to do a specific type of trust for you. We can illustrate how that trust would work by way of death in this tool. So there's really not a lot that we can't do. It's very powerful software. Again, it's only as good as the person who's running it. I have to say that, and it's not just my ego. It's similar to your business as well, right? I could go in and push the buttons on your Xerox machine, but I promise you I couldn't get a shiny tooth from it. So, again, it definitely goes hand in hand in terms of having the practitioner who understands the big picture and what you're trying to accomplish, and then using the appropriate tools. So I think that's about it. Again, I'd say it's an iterative process. It's process over product. It's a process, not an event, right? It's something that is going to happen over a long period of time. And again, this idea of iteration and what if scenarios, in my mind, really allows people to be able to dream and think and be creative about what they want for their future. Because it's not uncommon that when I'll meet with someone, they'll say, well, I'm thinking about working a couple more years, then we're going to retire to Florida. Really? You want to go to Florida? Well, maybe we won't go to Florida. Maybe we'll start a bed and breakfast. But do I really want to start a bed and breakfast? Again, my feeling is great. Let's have all these conversations and let's understand the financial implications of each of them. And it's amazing how often we'll go down a certain path and people will realize, geez, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? And we check the box and we move on. Again, it's really fun for me to be a part of that. And, anybody that knows me, or I hope who has worked with me would say, again, even people in my firm and otherwise will talk about how slow and long my process is. And again, from my perspective, it takes as long as it takes for us to go down every path. And then once we do that, and then, of course, we're happy to help people implement, but that really comes much, much further down the road after we've figured out what it is that we're doing. So thank you very much. There are some questions, it looks like, so let me just answer these, and I will get you guys all going in a reasonable amount of time. So, hey, Ashley. So, so the question is around risk and recommending retiring dentists exit more volatile investments like stocks and moving their money into more conservative things like bonds. So I'll say this, every decision in my mind is made based on risk tolerance and time horizon. So it's usually risk tolerance, time horizon, taxes, and fees. Those are usually how every decision, and I always say if you can answer all four of those things and feel good about what you're doing, then you're probably making a good decision. So the answer to that is that, certainly in a world that we're in right now, we're 12 years in an up market. That's unprecedented. This has never happened in the history of our economy. A typical market cycle might be 3 years up, 2 years down, something like that. So when you have a 12-year up market, and then you have whatever we had last year, if you polled most people in March of last year and said, where do you think things are going to be in December? I promise you very few people would have gotten what happened right. But back to the question is, you've got to be mindful of that risk tolerance and time horizon. And I'll go back to the financial plan in that, if you're meeting all of your objectives, right? Let's say that everything that you want and your trajectory allows you to do everything that you want to do, and you need a 5% rate of return. Well, if you're in 90% equities, you have to accept that there's a probability for fluctuation and volatility there. So we would argue in a lot of cases, well, why take any more risk than you have to take? Why not bring things back to just get a 6% rate of return, increase that probability and not take that risk? So, again, the answer is always it depends, but I would say all things being equal, yeah, somebody who's nearing needing, the preservation and distribution of their money probably shouldn't be playing around in 100% or high percentage of equity portfolio. They likely want to begin softening that range of returns by adding in some fixed income and some other asset classes. So great question. A question about inflation. Well, unfortunately, if money is printed the way money is being printed, unfortunately, there will likely and quite possibly be a fallout in the future, and an impact on inflation could be part of that fallout. So I have no crystal ball. I'd say the crystal ball is very murky right now for a lot of people, but all things being equal, that's how I would answer that question. Absolutely, Ashley. So very good. I think we're just at an hour. As I said, I didn't know if it would be 20 minutes or 2 hours, so we're somewhere right in the middle there. So I hope everyone can take some nugget from this, from tonight. And again, if I can answer any questions or be of any value, then please don't hesitate to give me a call. Otherwise, I'll be the wallpaper on the next Dental Science Society event. So Ashley, you have a question or something that you'd like to chat about with the group?
Sure. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Troy, for giving us your time and knowledge. I'll be sending out an email with once I get all the attendees, and then if you guys don't mind sending me back the CE evaluation, and I will send out the certificate. Our next meeting is going to be exactly a month from now on March 11th, and we're going to have Rob McGuire speaking. So I look forward to seeing all of you then. And again, thank you for your attendance, and thank you, Troy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ashley. Thank you, everyone. And we'll talk to you all soon. Have a great night.